10:22 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the bridge, his body burning with fever, watching something that should have been impossible. High above, where no one had been looking, American dive bombers were rolling into their attacks. They came in almost vertically, growing larger with terrifying speed, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The flight deck below was crowded with aircraft, armed and fueled, ready to launch against the American carriers that had been spotted 240 miles to the northeast. Torpedoes and bombs sat exposed. Aviation fuel lines ran across the deck. Every element necessary for a devastating strike was in place, except for one critical factor: time. Genda had been fighting pneumonia for days. The ship's doctor had confined him to bed, but he had refused to stay down. At 37 years old, he was one of the most innovative aviation tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack. He had developed new dive-bombing techniques over China. The idea of missing this battle had been unbearable. Now, wrapped in a coat despite the Pacific heat, he watched the American aircraft dive and understood with perfect clarity that everything was about to end. The first bomb struck amidships. The explosion penetrated to the hangar deck, where more aircraft waited, packed together, armed with their own ordnance. Secondary explosions followed immediately. Land attack bombs that had been hastily removed during a frantic rearming operation sat unsecured on the hangar deck. They detonated. Fire raced through the hangar, reached the flight deck, engulfed the aircraft spotted for launch. The ship's structure groaned. Black smoke poured from the wounds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, standing near Genda, seemed paralyzed. At 55 years old, he was a torpedo warfare specialist who had never particularly wanted to command carriers. Yet here he was, in charge of the Kido Butai, the first air fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. That attack had been flawless. Since then, his carriers had rampaged across the Pacific, striking at Darwin, at Ceylon, at targets no one could defend. They had seemed invincible. Now, in the span of seconds, his flagship was dying beneath his feet. Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, grabbed the admiral's arm. They needed to abandon the bridge. Fires were spreading. The carrier was finished. But Nagumo didn't move. He stared at the flames consuming his ship, at the aircraft burning on the deck, at the men running through smoke trying to fight fires that couldn't be fought. Kusaka would later write that in that moment, Nagumo looked like a man watching his own death. 2 miles away, the carrier Kaga took 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The explosions tore through her hangar decks, ignited fuel and munitions, transformed the carrier into an inferno within minutes. 3 miles to the south, Soryu absorbed 3 direct hits with the same devastating results. Fire spread faster than damage control parties could respond. Aircraft on the hangar decks cooked off, their bombs and torpedoes adding to the destruction. The carrier that had been preparing to launch a strike against American forces was now fighting just to keep her crew alive. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 fleet carriers in Nagumo's strike force had been transformed from instruments of Japanese naval power into burning wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, separated from the others by earlier maneuvering to avoid American torpedo attacks, had escaped the initial dive-bombing strike. But Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, watching from Hiryu's bridge, understood immediately what he was witnessing. The Kido Butai, the force that had humbled the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the force that had struck with impunity for 6 months, had just been gutted. Yamaguchi was 49 years old, a Princeton graduate who understood Americans better than most of his colleagues. He believed in aggressive carrier tactics, in striking first and striking hard. Now he watched 3 carriers burning and knew that everything had changed. His carrier was still operational. His aircraft were ready. He could strike back. But 3 carriers were gone, and with them, more than half the striking power that had made the Kido Butai the most feared naval force in the Pacific. The American dive bombers had arrived at the worst possible moment. For the past 2 hours, Nagumo's carriers had been under attack by American aircraft from Midway Island, by torpedo bombers from American carriers that intelligence had insisted weren't in the area. Every attack had been repulsed. Not a single American aircraft had scored a hit. The combat air patrol had shot down dozens of attackers. The anti-aircraft guns had filled the sky with fire. The Americans had seemed brave but incompetent, throwing away their aircraft in uncoordinated, almost suicidal attacks. But those attacks had had consequences no one on the Japanese side had recognized. They had forced the carriers to maneuver constantly, breaking formation, disrupting organization. They had kept the combat air patrol busy at low altitude, shooting down torpedo bombers, burning fuel, unable to climb to higher altitude where they might have spotted the approaching dive bombers. And they had delayed the launch of the Japanese strike against the American carriers, kept the flight decks cluttered with armed aircraft, created the perfect target for dive bombers that arrived at precisely 10:22. Aboard Akagi, Kusaka finally got Nagumo moving. They abandoned the bridge, made their way down through smoke-filled passages to the deck. The heat was intense. Men were struggling with fire hoses, but the water pressure was failing. Secondary explosions continued to rock the ship as ordnance cooked off in the fires. The carrier's structure was buckling. She was finished. A destroyer came alongside. Nagumo and his staff transferred across, climbing down rope ladders while explosions continued above them. Once aboard the destroyer, Nagumo would transfer again to the cruiser Nagara to maintain command of what remained of his force. But as he climbed down from his burning flagship, the admiral who had commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled now commanded 3 burning carriers, and one that remained operational but outnumbered. Genda, despite his fever, despite his weakness, helped coordinate the evacuation. He made sure all personnel who could be saved were off the ship before he descended the ladder himself. His face was grey with illness and exhaustion. He had stood on this bridge planning the Pearl Harbor attack. He had watched from this deck as Japanese aircraft launched to strike targets across the Pacific. Now he watched it burn. And he understood that this wasn't just the loss of a ship. This was the loss of Japanese naval supremacy in a single morning. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room when the first reports arrived. The transmission was brief, almost incomprehensible in its implications. Carrier Akagi hit, fires spreading. Yamamoto's face showed nothing. His composure was legendary. But his chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, would later write that the atmosphere in the operations room changed in that instant, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Yamamoto was 57 years old, a Harvard-educated officer who had spent years in America. He understood American industrial power better than most of his colleagues. He had opposed war with the United States, had told politicians he could run wild for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had no confidence in victory. Now, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the warning he had given was about to be proven correct. 20 minutes after the first report, another message arrived. Kaga burning. Then, minutes later, Soryu hit. By early afternoon, 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were blazing wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal, their hangars infernos. Yamamoto said almost nothing. He walked to the window, looked out at the grey Pacific, and remained there for several minutes. When he finally spoke, according to Ugaki's diary, he said, "The operation will continue." But even as he gave that order, Yamamoto must have known what these losses meant. The 4 carriers represented not just ships, but Japan's entire doctrine of naval warfare. They carried the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, men who had trained for years, who had perfected the art of dive bombing and torpedo runs over China and at Pearl Harbor. And now, in the span of 5 minutes that morning, American dive bombers had destroyed 3 of them. The 4th, Hiryu, would be scuttled the next day, burning and unsalvageable. The full scope of the disaster revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. Each new radio report brought worse news. By evening of June 4th, Yamamoto's staff had compiled initial casualty estimates. The numbers were staggering. Approximately 3,000 men lost, more than 200 aircraft destroyed. But worse than the ships, worse than the planes, were the pilots. Over 100 of Japan's most experienced carrier aviators were dead, drowned in the Pacific, or burned alive in their cockpits. These were men who could land a dive bomber on a carrier deck in rough seas, who could put a torpedo into a moving ship from 500 feet, who had trained since the mid-1930s. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led strike forces from Hiryu, was dead. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa, who had pioneered dive-bombing techniques and led attacks at Pearl Harbor, was dead. These men had been irreplaceable before the battle. Now they were gone. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer aboard Yamato, watched Yamamoto that evening. The Admiral sat at the table in his cabin, documents spread before him, but he wasn't reading them. He was staring at the wall. Watanabe had served with Yamamoto for 3 years and had never seen him like this. The Admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had argued against war with America but had executed it brilliantly when ordered, now looked, in Watanabe's words, like a man who had aged 10 years in one day. But Yamamoto's personal anguish remained private. To his staff, to his subordinate commanders, he maintained the facade of command. At 11 that night, he sent a message to Nagumo. The Midway operation is to be continued. He ordered the remaining surface ships to press forward, to engage the American fleet in a night battle where Japan's superior battleships might turn defeat into victory. It was a desperate gamble, and Yamamoto knew it. But the alternative was to accept that the entire operation, planned for months, executed with precision until that morning, had become a catastrophic failure. 300 miles to the east, aboard the cruiser Nagara, Nagumo read Yamamoto's order with something close to disbelief. He had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, had led the rampage across the Pacific that destroyed Allied naval power from Hawaii to Ceylon. He was a cautious man, thrust into the role of carrier warfare pioneer, and now, in one morning, he had lost all 4 of his carriers. Kusaka later described the scene on Nagara's bridge that evening. Nagumo sat in his chair, still wearing his uniform from the morning, stained with sweat and smoke. He had transferred from Akagi just before the carrier had to be abandoned, had watched from Nagara's deck as his flagship burned. Now he read Yamamoto's order to continue the operation and shook his head. "With what?" he asked Kusaka. "With what am I to attack?" It was a reasonable question. Nagumo's strike force had been built around the 4 carriers. Without them, he commanded a collection of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers with no air cover, no reconnaissance capability, no ability to strike at the American carriers that had devastated his force. To press forward toward Midway now would be to sail into range of American land-based bombers to offer his remaining ships as targets. Kusaka, who had argued for caution all day, now argued for withdrawal. The operation, he told Nagumo, was lost. To sacrifice more ships would accomplish nothing. The American carriers were still out there, still capable of launching strikes. Japanese intelligence had been wrong about everything, wrong about the American carriers being near Hawaii, wrong about American readiness, wrong about American capability. To continue now would be to compound the disaster. Nagumo composed his response to Yamamoto carefully. He reported his remaining strength. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers. He reported the enemy situation. At least 2 American carriers still operational, land-based aircraft at Midway. He did not explicitly refuse Yamamoto's order, but his message made clear the impossibility of continuing. The strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months no longer existed as an offensive weapon. At 2 in the morning on June 5th, Yamamoto finally accepted reality. He ordered the Midway operation cancelled. The fleet would withdraw. But even in withdrawal, the losses continued. The heavy cruiser, Mikuma, damaged in a collision while maneuvering to avoid a submarine, fell behind the retreating fleet. On June 6th, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found her. Captain Shikao Sakiyama, Mikuma's commanding officer, fought his ship to the end. His anti-aircraft guns fired until the final bomb hit severed the cruiser in two. Sakiyama went down with his ship. 243 more men dead. The battle that was supposed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 3,000 men, and more than 200 aircraft. More importantly, it had cost Japan something that couldn't be measured in ships or planes or men: the initiative. Yamamoto received the report of Mikuma's loss aboard Yamato as the fleet steamed west toward Japan. According to Ugaki's diary, the admiral read the message, placed it on his desk, and said nothing for several minutes. Then he stood, walked to his cabin, and closed the door. He remained there for 3 hours. What he did in those hours, Ugaki never recorded. But when Yamamoto emerged, his face was composed again, his voice steady. He called his staff together and began planning the defense of the Solomons, the next likely American target. Yet even as Yamamoto maintained his composure, the full implications of Midway were becoming clear to Japan's naval leadership. On June 8th, as the fleet approached Japanese waters, Yamamoto sent a detailed report to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The report listed the losses with clinical precision. 4 fleet carriers sunk: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 1 heavy cruiser sunk: Mikuma. 248 aircraft destroyed. 3,057 men killed. Among the dead, 110 carrier pilots, including some of the most experienced aviators in the Imperial Navy. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, read Yamamoto's report in his office in Tokyo. Nagano was 61 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, a man who had helped plan Japan's naval expansion in the 1930s. He understood immediately what these losses meant. Japan had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers of various sizes. 4 of the best were now at the bottom of the Pacific. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity, was building new carriers at a rate Japan could never match. The naval balance, which had favored Japan in December 1941, was shifting irrevocably. But Nagano's understanding of the strategic implications remained private. The Naval General Staff decided immediately that the Midway defeat would be concealed from the Japanese public. The official announcement, released on June 10th, reported a successful operation in which Japanese forces had inflicted severe damage on American forces while suffering some losses. The 4 carriers were not mentioned. The 3,000 dead were reduced to light casualties. Even within the Navy, information about Midway was restricted. Officers not directly involved in the operation were told only that there had been some setbacks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The survivors of the carrier strike force returned to Japan in mid-June. They arrived not at major ports, but at remote anchorages where they could be kept isolated. The wounded were transferred to hospitals in the middle of the night, their injuries attributed to training accidents. The dead were buried quietly, their families told they had died in action but given no details. Pilots who had survived the battle were reassigned immediately to training duties or to other units scattered across the Pacific, to prevent them from talking to each other about what had happened. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and had been wounded aboard Akagi during the Midway battle, spent weeks in a naval hospital outside Tokyo. Fuchida had been on Akagi's bridge when the American bombs hit, had broken both ankles jumping to a lower deck to escape the fires. From his hospital bed, he watched as other Midway survivors arrived. He saw the burns, the shattered limbs, the 1,000-yard stares of men who had watched their ships die. The hospital staff had been ordered not to discuss the battle, but the wounded told their stories to each other in whispers. 4 carriers gone, all those pilots dead. The Americans had known exactly where to find them. That last detail troubled Fuchida more than anything else. The American dive bombers had arrived at the perfect moment, just as the Japanese carriers were rearming their aircraft, when their flight decks were covered with bombs and torpedoes. It seemed too precise to be luck. Had American intelligence broken Japanese codes? Had there been a spy? Fuchida didn't know, but the question haunted him. If the Americans could read Japanese naval communications, then every operation, every movement, was compromised. The war that had started with such devastating success at Pearl Harbor might be unwinnable if the Americans knew Japan's plans before they were executed. In late June, the Naval General Staff convened a conference to analyze the Midway defeat. The meeting was held in a secure building in Tokyo, attended by fewer than 20 officers. Yamamoto was not present. He remained with the fleet at Truk, but his chief of staff, Ugaki, attended and presented Yamamoto's analysis. According to notes from the meeting, Ugaki's presentation was blunt. The operation had failed, he said, because of 3 factors. American intelligence had given them advanced warning, allowing them to position their carriers perfectly. Japanese reconnaissance had failed to detect the American carriers until too late, and Japanese carrier doctrine, which emphasized attack over defense, had left the carriers vulnerable when caught with aircraft on deck. The officers at the conference debated these points for hours. Some argued that the defeat was simply bad luck, that if the Japanese scouts had found the American carriers 30 minutes earlier, if the American dive bombers had arrived 30 minutes later, the battle would have gone differently. Others, including Ugaki, argued that Midway revealed fundamental flaws in Japanese naval strategy. Japan, they said, could not win a war of attrition against America's industrial capacity. The only path to victory had been to destroy the American fleet quickly, force a negotiated peace before American production overwhelmed Japanese forces. Midway had been the last chance to do that. Now that chance was gone. The Americans had learned they could defeat Japanese carriers. The myth of Japanese invincibility, built over 6 months of unbroken victories, had been shattered in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the operations section, listened to these arguments with growing alarm. Fukudome had helped plan the Midway operation, had believed it would force the decisive battle that would break American naval power. Now he heard his colleagues saying that decisive battle was no longer possible, that Japan faced a long war it could not win. After the conference, Fukudome met privately with Nagano. What he said in that meeting was never recorded, but Fukudome's subsequent actions suggest he argued for a fundamental reassessment of Japanese strategy. Within weeks, the Navy began shifting resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations, building up bases in the Central Pacific, fortifying islands that might block American advances. But these strategic adjustments were made quietly, without public acknowledgement that anything had changed. The official narrative remained one of Japanese success, of American defeats. The newspapers reported victories in New Guinea, in the Solomons, in the Aleutians. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway was never mentioned. Even within the Navy, many officers remained unaware of the full scope of the disaster. Captains of destroyers, submarine commanders, base commanders in the South Pacific. They knew something had gone wrong at Midway, but not what. This information control extended even to the families of the dead. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the second attack wave from Hiryu and had deliberately crashed his burning plane into the sea when he ran out of fuel, was posthumously promoted and decorated. But his widow was told only that he had died in action against the enemy. She was not told where or how, or that his carrier had been destroyed. Across Japan, 3,000 families received similar notifications. Killed in action. No details, no explanation, just death in service of the emperor. The psychological impact of Midway on Japanese naval officers who knew the truth was profound. Captain Tameichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Shigure in the Aleutians during the Midway operation, returned to Japan in July and learned what had happened from other officers. Hara later wrote that the news hit him like a physical blow. The 4 carriers represented not just combat power but the entire philosophy of Japanese naval aviation. Their loss meant that everything the Navy had built since the Washington Naval Treaty, every innovation in carrier tactics and aircraft design, had been negated in one morning. "We had believed ourselves invincible," Hara wrote. "After Midway, we knew we were mortal. That sense of mortality spread through the Navy's officer corps over the summer of 1942. As more officers learned the truth about Midway, as the survivors returned to their units and told their stories, the confidence that had characterized the Japanese Navy since Pearl Harbor began to erode. The Navy had lost battles before. At Coral Sea in May, it had lost the light carrier Shoho. But Midway was different. Midway was catastrophic. Midway suggested that American naval aviation was not inferior to Japanese, that American intelligence and American determination could overcome Japanese skill and Japanese planning. Yamamoto himself never fully recovered from Midway. According to officers who served with him after the battle, he became more withdrawn, more fatalistic. He continued to plan operations, to command the combined fleet, but the aggressive confidence that had marked his leadership in the first 6 months of the war was gone. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, who had observed Yamamoto on the night of June 4th, saw the change persist through the summer and fall. The Admiral was still brilliant, Watanabe later wrote, but it was the brilliance of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle. In August, Yamamoto moved his headquarters to Rabaul to oversee operations in the Solomons. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, threatening Japan's southern perimeter. The Navy committed heavy forces to the campaign, trying to dislodge the American beachhead. But without the 4 carriers lost at Midway, without the experienced pilots who had died there, Japanese naval aviation struggled. The carrier, Ryujo, was sunk in August. Dozens more aircraft were lost over Guadalcanal. The pilots who replaced the Midway dead were younger, less experienced, trained in months rather than years. They fought bravely, but they died in numbers that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. By October, even officers who hadn't been at Midway understood that something fundamental had changed. The Navy was still winning tactical victories. At Savo Island in August, Japanese cruisers had devastated an American force, but the strategic initiative had shifted. Japan was reacting to American moves, defending rather than attacking. The offensive that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean had stalled, and everyone knew why, even if they couldn't say it openly. Midway. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, reflected on this in his diary in November. "We lost more than 4 carriers at Midway," he wrote. "We lost the belief that we could not be beaten. The Americans learned they could defeat us. We learned we could be defeated. Everything that has happened since June 4th flows from that knowledge. That knowledge was confirmed in the battles that followed. At Santa Cruz in October, the carrier Hornet was sunk, but Japan lost so many aircraft and pilots that the victory was hollow. At Guadalcanal in November, Japanese battleships bombarded Henderson Field, but couldn't prevent American reinforcements from landing. By December, the Navy had lost more carriers, more cruisers, more destroyers than it could replace. The industrial advantage that Yamamoto had warned about before the war was becoming reality. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff continued to issue optimistic reports, continued to claim victories, continued to conceal losses. But the officers who had seen the casualty lists, who had read the after-action reports, who had watched the fleet shrink month by month, knew the truth. Japan was losing the war. Not quickly, not obviously, but inexorably. And it had started at Midway. The junior officers, the ones who had survived the carrier battles, who had seen the American dive bombers overhead, who had pulled burned pilots from the water, understood this most clearly. Ensign Takayoshi Morinaga, who had been a fighter pilot aboard Soryu, survived the battle and was reassigned to a land-based unit in the Solomons. In a letter to his brother in December 1942, Morinaga wrote, "We were told Midway was a victory, but I was there. I saw Soryu burning. I saw the pilots who didn't come back. We lost, and we keep losing. The Americans have more planes, more pilots, more ships. We shoot them down and more come. We sink their ships and more arrive. I don't know how this war ends, but I know it doesn't end the way we were promised." Morinaga's letter was intercepted by military censors and never delivered. He was killed in January 1943 when his Zero was shot down over Guadalcanal. He was 23 years old. In his logbook, found after his death, he had recorded his missions, his kills, his near misses. On June 4th, 1942, he had written simply, "Midway. Everything changed." That was the assessment that Japanese naval officers, from admirals to ensigns, came to share in the months after the battle. Everything had changed at Midway. The 4 carriers were gone. But more than that, the strategic initiative was gone. The psychological advantage was gone. The belief in inevitable victory was gone. The war would continue for nearly 3 more years. There would be more battles, more victories, more defeats. But the trajectory was set on June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed aircraft and in 5 minutes destroyed the foundation of Japanese naval power. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. In April 1943, while flying to inspect bases in the Solomons, his plane was intercepted by American fighters who had been waiting for him, guided by decoded Japanese communications. As his plane fell toward the jungle, burning, Yamamoto may have thought back to that day in June, to the radio reports crackling in Yamato's operations room, to the moment when he knew the operation had failed. He had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but could not win a long war against America. Midway had ended the running wild. Everything after was the long war he had predicted and feared. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, lay on the bottom of the Pacific, 3 miles down. Their hulls broken, their hangar decks collapsed, their aircraft scattered across the ocean floor. With them lay 3,000 men, including the pilots who had been Japan's elite, the men who had trained for years to master the art of carrier warfare. Those men, those ships, that expertise could not be replaced. The Japanese Navy fought on for 3 more years, but it fought without the advantage it had possessed on December 7th, 1941. It fought knowing what its admirals had learned at Midway, that American intelligence could find them, that American dive bombers could destroy them, that American industrial power could overwhelm them. What did Japanese admirals say when they saw the losses after Midway? Publicly, they said nothing. The battle was classified, the casualties concealed, the defeat transformed into a victory in official reports. But privately, in staff meetings and diaries and quiet conversations, they said what Ugaki had written, that they had lost more than ships, that they had lost the belief in victory, that everything had changed. They said what Nagumo had asked on Nagara's bridge. With what am I to attack? They said what Yamamoto had shown through his silence, that the war they had started with such confidence was now a war they might not win. And in the years that followed, as the American fleet grew larger and Japan's grew smaller, as the battles moved closer to Japan itself, as the losses mounted beyond anything imagined in June 1942, those admirals learned the full meaning of what had happened at Midway. They learned that 5 minutes could decide a war, that intelligence could matter more than courage, that industrial capacity could overcome tactical brilliance. They learned, as Yamamoto had warned, that Japan could not win a long war against America. And they learned it all from 4 burning carriers sinking into the Pacific, taking with them not just ships and men, but Japan's hope of victory. The title that brought you here mentioned 8 carriers, and in a sense, that number reflects the totality of the disaster. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed in those 5 minutes at 10:22 on the morning of June 4th. But the ripple effects touched every carrier in Japan's fleet, every naval operation that followed, every strategic calculation from that moment forward. The loss of those 4 ships meant the effective end of Japan's carrier warfare capability, the collapse of the doctrine that had guided Japanese naval planning, and the beginning of a defensive war that could only end one way. The admirals who survived Midway carried that knowledge with them until the end. Nagumo would die in July 1944 during the American invasion of Saipan, taking his own life as American forces overran the island. Kusaka would survive the war and spend his remaining years trying to explain how the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled had been destroyed in 5 minutes. Genda would recover from his pneumonia and continue to serve, watching as each subsequent battle confirmed what Midway had revealed. that Japan's brief moment of naval supremacy was over. The words spoken by Japanese admirals in the hours and days after Midway were words of shock, of disbelief, of slowly dawning understanding that the war had changed irrevocably. They were the words of men who had believed themselves invincible, discovering their mortality. They were the words of professionals who understood, perhaps before anyone else in Japan, that the war could not be won. And they were words that would prove prophetic as the long, grinding struggle Yamamoto had feared became reality, leading inevitably to the end he had tried to prevent, but had always known was coming. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.